I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by Max Blumenthal. Today we have a friend of the show, Mike Prysner, who is an amazing activist and organizer. He also recently launched a podcast of his own, which we can talk about. And Mike is also a veteran. And today we're going to talk about the anti-war movement, the veteran community, and specifically John McCain, the Arizona neoconservative senator who just passed away 2 weeks ago now. And he was lionized by both Republicans and Democrats. In fact, he's more popular now among Democrats than he was among Republicans during his life, which is wild. And we're going to talk about the Democratic Party's attack on the anti-war movement and basically the attempt to try to bring back this neoconservative politics in the age of Trump, to normalize it as bipartisan and to portray it as like a kind of resistance. So now John McCain is seen as a resistance figure. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me, y'all.
Yeah, I want to, I guess, talk about McCain and what he symbolizes to veterans, because his own experience as a veteran was very different from a lot of other people who served in Vietnam, including John Kerry. But, you know, most of the people who served in Vietnam were conscripted under penalty of going to prison. They were working class or poor. They were disproportionately people of color. And I remember two events during the campaign, during the 2016 primary campaigns, that really cut to the heart of what Vietnam and the real lived experience of Vietnam vets meant in our politics. And it wasn't the experience that the bipartisan elite wanted to kind of convey through McCain's funeral. The first instance I really remember, and you can play a clip of this, is Donald Trump trashing John McCain repeatedly and saying, you know, that he wasn't actually a hero.
Frank, let me get to it. He hit me. He's not a war hero. He's a war hero. He's a war hero.
5.5 years.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
Do you agree with that?
He's a war hero because he was captured, okay?
Trump, after making this statement, was, you know, the Beltway press corps pronounced him dead. They said, he'll never recover from this. Everybody loves John McCain, and Trump went up in the polls. And a lot of the people who wound up electing Trump had served in Vietnam or were part of that generation and felt sort of betrayed. Bernie Sanders, also in the primary, trashed Henry Kissinger, who was, of course, the architect of one of the architects of Vietnam, helped postpone the war, partly for domestic political considerations. He rejected peace talks around 1968 to help get Nixon reelected, which meant John McCain had to spend more time in the Hanoi Hilton. Kissinger, of course, spoke at McCain's funeral. But Bernie trashed Kissinger because Hillary had said that he's one of her mentors. And I think this was a very emotional moment for a lot of people who had protested Vietnam or who had served in the war and saw Henry Kissinger as a uniquely villainous character. So first, I guess, Mike, as a veteran, as someone who went into the Iraq War, believing in at least some part of the military and the war, you entered a war that John McCain was also, wearing on his sleeve as one of his accomplishments. What do you think of McCain? But also, I mean, what does the veteran community think of him? And I mean, including people who served in Vietnam and might have participated in Winter Soldier, and just your thoughts on the funeral.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I mean, personally, I was part of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so for me, it was like, I remember very clearly the politicians that were really leading the charge, the ones that were out there in the press all the time, standing up in Congress, the ones that were really making the case for why we needed to do this. And so, of course, John McCain was one of those people. Same as he is with every war that the U.S. starts, we can count on John McCain to be there to use his credentials as a veteran and as a former POW and as someone with medals for valor, using those things to send other people to war, to die on the ground, and civilians to be killed. So, for me personally, McCain represents a betrayal. He's no different to me than George W. Bush, than Donald Rumsfeld, than Dick Cheney, except the difference is he used his military service to send us. When Bush and all of them were saying, let's go to it, and they were lying about it, they weren't using the fact that, I've been, and so I would never send someone to war without knowing what it's like myself. So it's like John McCain almost played like a more sinister role because, he was in fact using his position as a veteran to create more veterans. But it didn't end with just, and then we know now that McCain was just lying. He knew that it was BS intelligence. He knew that the intelligence reports were false. So all of the trumped up things, McCain wasn't just thinking that, they were real, I believe this intelligence, and this is how we should act based on the intelligence. He knew it was BS, and he sent us anyway. He actually came to visit our unit in Iraq. I remember seeing him walking around the base one time. He looked like he was on his last leg then. It's amazing that it was 15 years ago. But it wasn't just with the invasion. That was a lot of imperial arrogance from the politicians who thought like, this is going to be a really easy thing to take over Iraq, and then we'll go to these other countries. But he's also personally terrible to me because when he ran against President Obama, then candidate Obama, a lot of that election was about the Iraq war. I think people really forget that so much of it was like who was for the war and who was against the war. Obama was like the most against the Iraq war, even though he was really for it. He was just for downsizing it. But because Obama was like the most seemingly against the Iraq war, that's in a lot of ways what propelled him to get the nomination and into the presidency, whereas John McCain was the opposite. John McCain was the one advocating for winning in Iraq and sending more soldiers to Iraq, and like he was really fighting for, this is a time when the war was going extremely terribly. It was obvious we just needed to get out of there, and McCain was essentially campaigning on, let's keep this thing going. Let's send more bodies into the meat grinder. So, I have a personal hatred for McCain just based on those things alone. But I think for veterans as a whole, McCain was an officer, and most of the Army and most of the military is enlisted people. So just that, there's a great divide. And so we don't really identify with him as a veteran, the rank and file of the military, because it's a completely different existence. When John McCain was in and now, it's like, if you're an officer, you're in an extremely privileged position. They give you a house, they give you way higher pay, you get your little private officer clubs, you don't have to deal with any of the BS that every soldier has to deal with. You're in this protected position, and you're also in this protected position in combat and in war, where the officers are the ones that are the most safe, the least likely to die, and in fact are the ones that are responsible for others dying because they're ordering others to go and die. Now McCain, of course, is a little different because he was a pilot. So, they were, staying in like some resort, and then every day they'd fly a plane and go bomb a bunch of civilians, and they'd go back and have cocktails at this little poolside bar or whatever. So the experience of people who were in Vietnam and the many Vietnam veterans I know who became anti-war activists, no one can identify with his experience at all. There's very few, former pilots who became, anti-war activists. So he just represents like kind of tiny sliver of the military, like, the officer caste almost. It's very privileged class within the military. And so by and large, most veterans today and most people in the military today, we don't identify with these kind of people. They lived a completely different existence.
And this is a really important point. A lot of people don't know this about John McCain. And he actually never really stressed it throughout his life. McCain is portrayed as this kind of bipartisan war hero. But if you actually look at his extremely privileged upbringing, his father and his grandfather were both admirals in the U.S. Navy. He was born actually in the Panama Canal Zone, the U.S. military base there. So his entire life he was part of like the upper caste of the military, if you will, as you put it. And pretty hilarious. One of the most funny things about McCain is, so he went to the U.S. Naval Academy, and he was notorious for being a womanizer, for being very bad at school. He was very reckless, and in fact, out of his class, There were 899 people in his class at the Naval Academy. He came in 5th from the bottom, 894th out of 899th. He was almost the worst in his entire class, but because his family were prominent admirals in the Navy, he was promoted and given all of this throughout his life and treated essentially like royalty inside the military.
Yeah, I mean, it's a military aristocracy. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's no different than, and, if you watch like Civil War movies or something, and there's like everyone in the big mansion hanging out, and it's like, am I going to be a mine owner or am I going to be an officer and command soldiers? It's like, just a ruling class position. It's like you either go and you become an officer or you go run some massive company or something like that. And it's just a means to get to a further place. It's like, I'll do my 8 years as an officer and become a war hero, and then I will run for office. And so I think McCain had that in his mind from the very beginning. He came from this well-groomed stock, and he was like, I will go and be a war hero in Vietnam, and then I'll come back and I'll be set up as a politician. And so, yeah, I mean, when he was a POW, I think very quickly he knew that he was going to be set. I mean, I don't think he believed he was going to be executed as a POW in Vietnam. He was going to be treated well, and then that he knew he was going to come out and then come home as a war hero and then be able to have a, illustrious political career, which is exactly what happened.
There's going to be some shitty Hollywood movie about McCain soon, and it will be completely designed to help America further get over the Vietnam syndrome. Another fact that very few Americans know about John McCain is that when he went on his final mission, I think he was part of a 30 or 20 plane strike force that was attacking a civilian bridge and a power plant near Hanoi, or in Hanoi, as well as a civilian light bulb factory that was employed almost an entirely female workforce. So basically committing acts of state terror against the infrastructure of North Vietnam. And he was taken down by a Soviet officer who was helping to man a battalion of SAMs, of surface-to-air missiles. And that officer actually, is an admired figure today in Russia. He takes full credit for it. He's unrepentant. There was an effort by the Communist Party in St. Petersburg in 2008 to actually give this figure, whose name I forget, a medal. But McCain well understood that he had been taken down by a Russian, and that really informed his hatred of Russia. McCain was a central figure in Russiagate, in leaking the Steele dossier to the media, and using Russia as a lever against Trump, and really his intention was to bring back hostility against Russia. And I wrote about in Consortium News how McCain's hatred of the Soviet Union, of Russians, and of communism in general prompted him to join the World Anti-Communist League, which was an international umbrella organization that brought together death squad leaders in Central America, Ukrainian Nazis like Yaroslav Stetsko, who actually sent Jews to death camps, and right-wingers, right-wing anti-communists like McCain in the West. That is a really remarkable episode of John McCain's history. But the reason I'm bringing it up is just to bring up kind of the lessons that people take away from war. Because you, Mike, took a totally different lesson away from the Iraq War that John McCain took away from Vietnam. And I think, that's kind of the part of the history of veterans, is this kind of competition in lessons and narratives.
Yeah, it's like the reason, I said earlier that wasn't a lot of bomber pilots that became anti-war activists. And, I think there's not one reason why, but I think one of the, a big reason is that even if you're going into the war, like I did, like many people I know, and like many people in Vietnam, you can go into the war believing everything is good and right and that you're doing the right thing. But once you come in contact with civilian suffering, that's when you can really quickly make up your mind about, are you really for this morally, or are you against it morally? And when you're a pilot like John McCain, you're a mile above the ground. You're not seeing anything. It's funny that he became anti-Russia because of Russian China. It's like, how dare they prevent him from bombing this light bulb factory of women workers? What I mean? But if like the soldiers on the ground who would then walk through, and be checking for weapons and all these things and seeing the carnage that John McCain caused, many of those people, that's what woke them up and turned them into mutinous soldiers, activists, or soldiers that murdered their own officers, which of course was pretty widespread in Vietnam. And so there's like extreme disconnect. Like I said, I mean, John McCain's life was very much like sitting poolside, going on a bombing run, and then returning poolside, and only seeing little flashes on the ground of what he was doing. I personally don't think if he did see the carnage on the ground that he would have cared. I'm sure he would have been completely fine with it, because it's not just about what you're coming in contact with personally. It's there's like this other element, this class element, this other political background to it, where, you know, working class guys, you know, who are going to get sent to go pick up the pieces of what John McCain does, I mean, they can identify more with the Vietnamese people, right? I mean, they can say, these are poor people who are just screwed over, have a hard life, and these people are going to come, you know, people are making their life harder. You know, they can kind of relate in the sense, oh, I came from a difficult neighborhood in the US, and I got screwed over by being conscripted or forced to volunteer so I could go to this war. There's a much easier way to see eye to eye, whereas John McCain, I mean, he wasn't running into dead Vietnamese people who had famous grandfathers and fathers who were setting them up. You know, he wasn't running into, you know, he wasn't bombing mansions in Vietnam and things like that, where he could have some kind of, see some kind of class interest with the people that he was hurting. So yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that's why he's not accepted really in the veterans community in a lot of ways.
And not to belabor this point, because I do want to talk a bit more about McCain after his death and the kind of image that's been rehabilitated by Democrats largely, but while we're still on the subject of Vietnam, I mean, a lot of Americans don't really understand how not only horrific, but borderline genocidal this war was. We're talking about 3.8 million Vietnamese were killed, where the U.S. was using napalm and other extreme forms of warfare, Agent Orange on civilians, trying to destroy as many crops as possible, bombing civilian infrastructure to kill as many people as possible. Of course, people know about My Lai and like the massacre of women and children, but McCain, as a bomber, the point you're mentioning is that he was, you know, complicit in a lot. Most of the deaths were not on the ground by grunts. Most of the deaths were caused by the bombing, and like that disconnect is really important to understand, and how that it mirrors the class divide between the grunts who are on the ground and who are ultimately, you know, sent as kind of cannon fodder, and they're conscripted and they're largely black and Latino in the case of the Vietnam War, working class and poor. Just to understand like the dynamics of this war, it's really important, I think, and like that's been a lot largely erased in current wars.
Well, and also the aftermath of the war was that the military reorganized in order to prevent the kind of mass social resistance that took place among the middle class in the U.S., among the youth who were able to avoid service, and established a professional army. Basically, you could even call it in some ways a mercenary army, because there were enticements to working class youth. Oh, we'll send you to college, you know, we'll help finance your education if you go and kill other poor people thousands of miles away. And McCain actually had a part in extending the war, at least played a part in the PR efforts. This is sort of another piece of the buried history of John McCain, where he actually went out in the press after he returned and attempted to pump up support for the secret bombing campaign in Cambodia and Laos. He was working with Henry Kissinger as kind of his advance man, doing PR in the public for a part of the war that the American public didn't even know existed until the Pentagon Papers emerged. This is the real McCain. And then, meanwhile, you had Rumsfeld and Cheney in the Ford administration, in the National Security Council, who were so desperate to get over Vietnam syndrome early on that they orchestrated a forgotten military imbroglio called the Mayaguez, the storming of the Mayaguez, where Khmer Rouge forces had actually captured an American merchant marine vessel, and Rumsfeld and Cheney, serving in the Ford NSC, helped organize a failed raid to seize that vessel back from the Khmer Rouge. Many Marines were killed, hostages were killed, and it wound up in a sort of extended hostage negotiation. And this was all an attempt to kind of show some American heroism and have kind of like a raid on Entebbe that's brought back the American spirit after the failure of Vietnam. So McCain was in the middle of all of this. And I think, if you look past Vietnam, it really helps set the stage for what McCain did after the Cold War. First, around Yugoslavia during the unipolar moment, McCain called for the U.S. to send in ground troops. He actually introduced a resolution calling for the U.S. to use ground troops in Yugoslavia against the Yugoslavian military. And that, flowed straight into Iraq. So the whole history of Vietnam really helps. You can draw a direct line from that and the aristocratic kind of imperial class that McCain represents. You can draw a direct line from that to the Iraq War that, Mike, you served in. Yeah,
totally. Really great. I mean, it's an interesting, like going back to the Vietnam War history, right? Kind of the hidden history of it, and like the things you got to with like who's really doing the fighting on the ground, all that stuff. When the Vietnam War started, the military commanders believed the U.S. military to be at its peak readiness. Never in the history of the U.S. military was morale so high, were people so well trained, and were we more well equipped to win a war. So they went from having the most equipped, highest morale, most confident that they could win a war, the best shape that the U.S. military has ever been in. Fast forward a couple years later, by 1971, the top commanders in Vietnam estimated that half of the U.S. armed forces were in rebellion, were part of the GI resistance movement. Half of the armed forces is quite large. I mean, that's like you're about to have a revolution in your country when half of the armed forces is ready to turn their guns around at their own government. So that's a pretty significant thing. And of course, it was mainly the people on the ground. And that's actually why this bombing campaign became so intensified, right? And of course, if you count Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the casualties are more around 5 million, mostly civilians. But they reached a point in about 1970 where they could not rely on ground troops anymore. They just simply couldn't. I mean, entire companies, which is like over 100 soldiers, were like sitting down on the battlefield and refusing to go forward. Or they would go on so-called search and avoid missions, where they would be ordered to go out on patrol and they would just go hide in the bushes for like 4 days and smoke weed for 4 days straight and then come back and be like, yeah, we did it. Or they would just murder their officers. I mean, that a few thousand officers were killed by their own guys, shooting, fragging, or stabbing them.
Yeah, let's talk about this for a second, because fragging, we all know that word, but it comes from the Vietnam War, where, again, thousands of officers were killed by the grunts under them. Like, this history is not well known at all, and it's been repressed, rightfully. I mean, the government is afraid of people knowing this history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes from the frag grenade, and so that was the method that was used. And so when we know the number of the number of fraggings, I think officially is around 900 or so, but that's only fraggings with a fragmentation grenade. That's only rolling the grenade in your officer's tent, blowing them up with a grenade. It doesn't count people who were stabbed, and it doesn't count officers that were shot, which I would think happened a lot more than fragging them. Fragging, he's asleep in his tent, you throw the grenade in and he blows up. Shooting officers, one of the main reasons that this happened, and so the movement did become political in a lot of ways, but there's just an important lessons for people who are thinking about GI rebellion and potential for rebellion within the military. It's not always political. In Vietnam, it wasn't always political, but it was about getting stupid orders from incompetent, hated officers. And that's what got most of them killed, right? I mean, look at the Vietnam War, and there's so many parallels with Afghanistan and with Iraq also. I don't think there's statistics about officers being killed in either of those places, but I would imagine that it has happened. But here's the situation in Vietnam, right? You're an officer who's going to be behind the front lines is going to say, go attack that hilltop, and order a company of his men to go attack the hilltop. 20 of them are going to get killed assaulting the hilltop. Then the next day, that officer is going to say, okay, now let's go to this hilltop. The same thing happens. And then the next day he says, let's go back to that other hilltop we abandoned because we abandoned it and then just got taken over again by the resistance. And then, so soldiers were realizing that they were getting killed for absolutely no reason. They didn't see any reason to fight. And not only did they see any reason to fight, they have this pampered, incompetent officer who's responsible for these orders. So they figure, well, if we just shoot him, he can't order us to do it anymore. And so that's like where kernels of rebellion start. And it can, of course, become political if there's the right political agitation at the time, or if there's politically conscious soldiers who were in that situation. But a lot of the rebellion was over that. And yeah, it's a real hidden history, is that the officers were hated. I mean, people still hate the officers in the military today. I mean, they're not well liked, and it's because they live this existence, and because it's their orders. Of course, another thing I'll say, just from an insider's perspective in the military, officers want their soldiers to be in combat. Because if an officer's soldiers are in combat, whether or not they're part of the battle, they get recognition and they get medals for it. So, when I was deployed, our company commander and company first sergeant both got bronze stars with V device for valor. Neither of them were a part of any fighting or anything. They were back in the command center on the radio telling people to go drive around in areas where they were going to get shot at. And that's what they got the bronze star for. So when you think about it in that way also, where an officer, he's going to be a career military guy. A lot of these enlisted soldiers, 80% of the rank and file military get out after their first enlistment. They sign up, they do their 4 years, they get out and they go into a civilian job. Officers, it's like a career track into intelligence apparatus, all these other things. But they need those medals. They need those combat awards. And the way they get those combat awards is making their guys be in combat. And then they get the glory for it. And that gets into a whole other interesting topic too. Awards are very political, where if you're a young enlisted soldier and you show valor in battle, the officer will be like, let's bump that down, because bronze stars and silver stars, that's reserved for us officers, us managers. So yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons to hate the officer class. And of course, yeah, a lot of them just got killed instead.
And John McCain was the embodiment of that.
Yeah, because he wasn't even at risk you couldn't even frag him. He was out in a resort somewhere.
And he was. Can we say he was tortured, or I mean, how should we think of his experience as a prisoner of war?
There's no way to know, because it's just his, only his testimony, I guess. I don't know if any Vietnamese who supervised him as a POW have testified to it or anything like that. But the Vietnam POW camps were not, like if you watch Deer Hunter and he's in like this cage and up to mud up to his neck and things like that. I mean, these are real gross exaggerations. I mean, they called it the Hanoi Hilton, I think, for a reason. It's like you're in army barracks, you can't leave. Whatever. And they knew they had this really important guy. And there's, they were waging a PR war also, the communists in Vietnam. They weren't trying to send people back with their fingernails pulled out and things like that. So I don't know a lot about that, but I'd be willing to bet that he did not have a bad time as a POW. Nothing, of course, even if he did, nothing compared to what he inflicted on other people. If they did beat him up or they did torture him a little bit, I mean, that's fine for them, for the Vietnamese to decide what they're going to do with him once they got his ass.
They say that his longtime aide John Weaver would have to comb his hair because he couldn't lift his arms above his shoulders. That could have been from the injury he endured when crash landing. He obviously received enough medical care to keep him alive. I don't know if he was tortured or not. What I can't stand, though, about so many Republicans is that they'll just be a right-wing Republican and be for pillaging the earth until they have a personal experience which connects them in some way to the rest of humanity. Yeah. Like some Republican who has a gay son, and then they'll suddenly be in favor of same-sex marriage. And I just hate that tendency among Republicans. So McCain said he was tortured, and so he has put up some kind of symbolic resistance to torture in Congress while supporting every other aspect of the war on terror and permanent war that not necessitates torture, but encourages it.
Yeah.
That really seems to be the one component of his military experience that, liberals connect to. And it made them they referred to him as a maverick for a long time. I mean, they didn't really say that in the end. He wasn't really a maverick. But before we get to that part, I mean, I want to talk about the significance of his funeral and what the whole propaganda value of it. But, going back to a point you made about, the end of the Vietnam War and the increasing reliance on bombing, we saw that kind of become the favored strategy of the American military as a whole after the Cold War. It tested it in Yugoslavia, and the Air Force was waging its own kind of PR campaign to increase its funding by saying, look, the Air Force was also in support of the R2P doctrine, right to protect. Look, we'll go save these people, these Bosnians who are going to get slaughtered by Milosevic. We don't have to commit any troops. McCain weirdly wanted to commit ground troops, which really shows his whole disconnect. But the Clinton administration went with the R2P doctrine and the Air Force. And this, we saw this kind of interregnum with Afghanistan and Iraq, where American troops came back in body bags. But then, when the Arab Spring rolled around and there was the push for Libyan intervention and Syrian intervention, we went back to the R2P doctrine. And McCain, he wasn't just thundering for intervention in Congress. He was actually one of the first Americans on the ground in Libya, as well as in Syria, taking an illegal trip there to actually court Islamist fighters as American proxies in place of American ground troops. So there's that side of McCain too, where it's just that he's just been so invested in war his whole life that he's even willing to whitewash former Al-Qaeda affiliates like Abdel Hakim Belhaj of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in order to have an intervention. And I just don't understand, why this couldn't be mentioned or even discussed on his death. I mean, the amount of destruction that was done, you would just think there'd be like one pundit who'd say, wait a minute, this guy literally went on stage with Ole Tianbach, the founder of the Svoboda and Social National Party, a neo-Nazi party, a guy who was photographed sig-heiling. John McCain went on stage with him in the Maidan and whitewashed Nazis. He whitewashed jihadists. He hung out with, Sunni sectarian fighters who had kidnapped Shia pilgrims in Syria. And instead, we actually got Jennifer Rubin, the neocon Likudnik columnist for the Washington Post, and Ben, you wrote about this for FAIR, writing an article touting John McCain's supposed human rights record and using the photo of him on stage with Tianbach, the literal neo-Nazi, to do it. I mean, that's how delusional the whole festival of celebration of John McCain was.
Well, and then you have, it just says everything about American politics right now, but in general. So you have the Washington Post, one of the major newspapers of record, owned by the richest person in the world, Jeff Bezos, and it published an op-ed by, as Max said, the neocon Likudnik columnist, Jennifer Rubin, portraying him as a human rights champion next to a Nazi under the slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." Again, this is the slogan of a newspaper that is owned by the richest person in the world, who in one day, today is September 5th, on September 4th, Bezos made $1.8 billion in terms of his market value in one day. He made nearly $2 billion in one day, and he owns this newspaper that says democracy dies in darkness, while it lauds the human rights records of people standing next to Nazis. You can't make that stuff up. It's just...
What were your impressions, Mike, of the funeral and the whole festival of celebration of McCain and what it signified over in the culture at large?
Yeah, well, it obviously was political opportunism. It was used as, this is the cool party that everyone's at. Ariana Grande is headlining. All the cool people are there. It's like a
wait. That was Aretha Franklin's funeral. So.
Oh yeah, my bad. No, she was amazing.
where Bill Clinton, who's a disgusting pig, was. I'll just say that video is creepy.
It's bad. It's bad. That misogyny is rampant.
Hey, the big dog's having a good time, but
yeah.
I'd rather be at Aretha Franklin's funeral.
Oh, much better.
Yeah.
And I would rather have Donald Trump speak at my funeral than Henry Kissinger any day.
Yeah. But it was obviously like this red carpet, super cool event, and Trump's not invited to the party, type of thing. So, sad for, I guess, if you have any sympathy for John McCain, sad that his final moment was just like a spectacle just for like some petty stuff to try to, get rid of another right-wing president. I don't know. So of course the funeral was very gross. To me, it was like, why don't you just honestly honor him? Like, these are all warmongers anyway. Why don't everyone say this guy was a champion for our interventions around the world and a champion for the wars that are so honorable and just? Like, why try to turn him into some peace-loving human rights guy? So I thought that was a little ridiculous, but I think that this is why he was always that favored choice for the one always cheerleading bombings, always cheerleading interventions, always cheerleading troop invasions, right? Because imagine McCain never served in the military. Imagine he was just this privileged kid who's, comes from privileged stock who are all war heroes. But imagine he wasn't, and he just went to an Ivy League school and came out and became a politician. Imagine if a non-veteran McCain had been acting the same way about war and sending people to war and advocating for war, it would be seen as a little like, oh man, this guy's really a war hawk, really a warmonger. But because he can claim that he was in battle and because he can claim that he suffered on a battlefield, all of a sudden it's okay for him to be out there being the loudest cheerleader for war. So I think that's the reason that he was always kind of, put in this role and respected in this role and made the center of war charges, because he could say, well, I've suffered from it, so I can say it, when that's, not even really true, I think.
Well, wait, so you're not saying that McCain's funeral was like the hub of resistance?
Oh, good God.
This is an actual New Yorker headline, an article by Susan Glasser.
That's by the way, that's the wife of Peter Baker, who's the New York Times chief White House correspondent. So, they're all invested in this together.
Yeah, there's this incestuous community of warmongers in the mainstream media. So this New Yorker article by Susan Glasser, it's titled, I kid you not, John McCain's funeral was the biggest resistance meeting yet. And of course, one of the most infamous quotes from this, which was reported on by Susan Glasser in a viral tweet, she wrote, "Make no mistake, the applause ringing out at the cathedral when Meghan McCain said, quote, 'America has no need to be made great again because America was always great,' end quote, is not standard." Susan Glasser added, "I've never heard applause at a funeral here before." First of all, who applauds at a funeral? That's just bizarre.
Yeah.
Well, Paul Wellstone's funeral. Do you remember Paul Wellstone's funeral?
I don't remember the funeral, but I remember him very well.
Yeah, well, Paul Wellstone, much more respectable character than McCain, one of the few real true liberals in Congress and an anti-war figure. But his funeral was viciously attacked on Fox News because it was turned into, he died in a plane crash right ahead of the midterms in 2002. And it was turned into a really disgusting election season rally by the DNC and the Democrats. And, it was just mocked, and it actually wound up costing the Democrats the midterms. But this funeral, in the same way, was kind of a political celebration as well. And there was applause. Applause for that line, which, Ben, you pointed out, America was always great. I wonder what Frederick Douglass would think of that line, or Sitting Bull.
And wasn't that Hillary Clinton's line anyway?
Or the descendants of people in Vietnam whose families were massacred, who are still suffering from the birth effects of Agent Orange. I mean, you can go on down the entire list, but it's just so disgusting seeing the attempt to whitewash that history as if this country was always great.
Oh, Ben, I actually saw there is a whole Twitter Moments curated thing that I could not believe. It said, Vietnamese mourn death of John McCain, and it was a Vietnamese woman crying, kissing a photo of him. And I was just like,
what? That is
what
such a
kind of
psyop.
garbage? I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was like, yeah, I'm sure there are some reactionary Vietnamese people in Vietnam who...
Well, it turns out she was like living in the U.S.
Yeah, she's in Orange County, man.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. But so, yeah, I mean, it was just really extreme levels of whitewashing, which was pretty disappointing because, it's just part of the problem we have is rewriting histories of wars. I mean, they've already rewritten the history of the Iraq War. When Obama ended the war and gave his speech, this is what we did, this is what it was all about. I mean, they started right away. And of course, all of this just helped to rewrite the history of Vietnam when, of course, history is extremely important to understand because, it echoes and reverberates through what's happening today.
I want to highlight one moment from the funeral. I don't know if either of you watched the speeches. I tried to actually sit through them. But Meghan McCain actually, it wasn't her speech. Susan Glasser said, an especially elegant presidential daughter. First of all, she's married to a proven plagiarist, Ben Domenech, and her speech was probably written by Mark Salter, who wrote John McCain's final letter and basically wrote all. It was the most heinous speech. It ended with like a line lifted from Peggy Noonan's Challenger speech for Reagan. But then there was this line about the Vietnam War. You can play it now.
The America of John McCain is, yes, the America of Vietnam. fighting the fight even in the most forlorn cause, even in the most grim circumstances, even in the most distant and hostile corner of the world, standing even defeat for the life and liberty of other peoples in other lands. The America of John McCain is generous and welcoming and bold.
Basically, what Meghan McCain did there was try to recast the Vietnam War as you heard it yourself, as a fight for life and liberty of other people, to rescue the Vietnamese people from communism. 1 million people just wiped away. They were liberated, I guess, from being alive. But that really, that really highlighted what this was about for me. Meghan McCain also said that her father, I think this is her quote, was born in a vanquished outpost of American power. So she's lamenting that the U.S. turned sovereignty over the Panama Canal Zone to the country that it was in, Panama, which was a big right-wing cause in the late 70s. So really what was happening there was the imperial elite, which is feeling the pressure, particularly from Trump being president, people being willing to elect Trump and, piss on McCain's service record, is attempting to kind of sacralize their position by wrapping themselves in John McCain's death shroud and really reviving the popularity of the bipartisan elite with little Twitter moments of George W. Bush, the author of 1 Million Dead Iraqis' funerals, passing a candy to Michelle Obama. So it wasn't just an anti-Trump rally. It was like a mega event for the empire. And it's flowed into this op-ed that we just saw, this anonymous op-ed we saw come out today in the New York Times, which ends with praising McCain, but is written by an anonymous supposed senior White House official declaring that the adults are in the room. Real Republicans like George W. Bush-minded Republicans are there who will fight for the empire and stymie Trump, and basically confirming the existence of an administrative soft coup. So that's really, to me, what the funeral represented. It was much bigger than one man.
And a celebration of American patriotism, you know what I mean?
Yeah. American exceptionalism and patriotism as synonymous with that.
Yep,
Shining city on the hill.
I just want to highlight one part of this New York Times op-ed because it's an important. A lot of times, some of the most important parts of these articles are just brief comments that are made in passing and then just taken for granted. So this is the New York Times op-ed published September 5th. It's called "I Am Part of the Resistance Inside the Trump Administration," and there's a single line in here that's a throwaway line, and this person wrote, quote, "Don't get me wrong. There are bright spots that the near ceaseless negative coverage of the Trump administration fails to capture. And then here are the bright spots: effective deregulation, historic tax reform, a more robust military, and more." So this is everything about what the resistance...
More means immigrant child prisons.
Exactly. So this represents everything about the priorities of the so-called resistance, of like the resistance with the TM sign, as I usually write. I mean, they're lamenting that Trump, his tone is bad, that he's vindictive against other people who should be his allies. They're criticizing him as a person. I mean, he's a ghastly monster. He's a ghoul. But then when it comes to his policies, this person's like, yeah, well, he has done some good things, like expand the military budget, deregulate companies, and cut taxes for the rich.
Yeah, I mean, what is the job of the president? It's being the CEO of the capitalist state, right? Your job as a president is supposed to be managing the common affairs of the ruling class, right? It's supposed to be out for all of them. And no one ever expected Trump to be out for everyone. He's an individualist guy. He cares about himself. And he's not out for the common interests of the capitalist state and the common interests of all the richest people in the country, which is why, I'd point out that in the election, like all of the Fortune 500 CEOs, that whole list, all of them were going for Hillary Clinton. All the people in those circles, people in the ruling class, they knew they couldn't trust Trump, so they didn't want him. I mean, so now, it's obvious that there's be this kind of backlash because he is kind of this buffoonish, individualist type character, not doing the job of the president. The job of the president isn't to have this figure passing what he believes is good or what he believes works for people. It's supposed to be what everyone kind of collectively wants in that kind of 0.01% of society.
Do you all remember an LA Times editorial, I think right before Trump was elected or right after he was elected. I think it was before. If Trump is elected, he will face a coup from the intelligence community by one neocon cadre named Jamie Kirchick.
I don't remember that.
It seems prescient now. We've since learned that, Trump's sort of outside foreign policy advisor, Carter Page, was put under NSA surveillance or FBI surveillance based on a FISA court's approval of a warrant that was justified simply by the Steele dossier. We've learned that Stefan Halper, a CIA and FBI asset, was inserted into the Trump campaign as a spy. We've learned that Trump Tower was wiretapped. Trump was sort of mocked for saying that. And now we've learned, if we're to believe this anonymous op-ed, that there is an administrative coup underway. Russia is cited as one major reason in this op-ed for these supposed adults in the room to actually defy civilian presidential authority. Obviously, we all agree that Trump is just sort of a monstrous figure. Whatever. That kind of goes without saying. It seems a little bit hard to argue that there's something wrong with all of these appointees and career professionals defying civilian authority. These are people that were not elected. And I think that the reason that the New York Times editorial board signed off on this anonymous editorial was because they thought that their readers would be so delighted by it and relieved by this news. And it's actually blowing up in their face. I see even like liberals rejecting the message in this editorial for different reasons. But I think the real reason to reject it, and this is definitely, McCain speaking from beyond the grave. The reason to reject it is just even if we don't live in a democracy, there should at least be some aspiration to have some civilian authority over this country.
Yeah, Max, you're absolutely right. And, it's not a far-fetched idea. I saw this headline recently that I thought was a bit misleading. Historically, it was some statement that was saying never before have so many inside the establishment been openly against a sitting president. And it's true, there are many in the establishment that are against him, but not so much as Jimmy Carter. And this is where I think Trump will really be in danger of this intelligence coup, is if he steps over the line in the way that Carter did. Now, on the domestic front, I don't think Trump's in danger of doing anything that's going to get him ousted. He's not going to try to do anything that curbs capitalist profits. But on foreign policy fronts, Jimmy Carter campaigned on removing troops from Korea. And when he won, and when he started to initiate this plan, all of the Pentagon generals became openly opposed to Carter. And they even took out a full-page ad in one of the major newspapers, all signing on, condemning Carter for this move, and they forced him to not do it. And it really showed that when you challenge militarism, when you challenge expansion, that's when the really internal powers, the ones behind the president, the ones that really wield power in society, that's when they really put their foot down. So, as long as Trump is, expanding the military and willing to put us on paths of new military adventures abroad, he might be okay, but that thing could really come into effect. The thing this editorial was implying could really come into effect if, say, he actually tries to have some kind of détente with Korea and actually tries to remove troops from Korea or something like that.
And actually, Korea is cited in the op-ed. I didn't know that about Carter in the ad by the generals, but Korea is actually explicitly cited as well, that Trump is a little bit too sympathetically predisposed to Kim Jong-un, as the author puts it. I would say, obviously, South Korea is the nexus or the hub of the archipelago of American bases in the Pacific, and any removal of American troops or even canceling one joint military drill is a huge threat. So it's right there in black and white in the New York Times, and that's actually a fascinating piece of history. I think that the atmosphere right now is very bad for left-wing anti-war organizing, and I wonder what you'll have to say about that. But I would just point to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's response to McCain's death. Obviously, it seems like she's overcompensating for marketing herself as a democratic socialist during her election campaign by hailing McCain as example of unparalleled human decency, which means that he is more decent than Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Ben Norton, which is impossible.
One of those doesn't really belong on the list.
I mean, just to use that kind of embarrassingly gratuitous language.
And it's Gandhi, but
I don't know who's writing it, but what's going on there? And, you know, how can you organize people in this kind of atmosphere when the, you know, great hope of democratic socialism, the DSA celebrity, is making these kind of statements? And so far I've seen no official statements from DSA. I mean, I think Portland DSA might have condemned it, but DSA as a whole isn't coming down on her and enforcing any party line.
Yeah, well, you know, I think in general that, you know, electoral politics are limited, right? I mean, you know, people who are radical, people who want to build movements, you know, if we channel all this energy into getting candidates elected, you know, in my opinion, that's a waste of resources on its own. I mean, I think it's important to run in the elections. I'm a member of the PSL, and we run in all the elections. But it's one of many things that you do. And so to kind of divert everything into, in a way, legitimizing the capitalist elections, which are quite undemocratic, you know, it's a good strategy in a lot of ways, but not as a complete overall strategy. You have to do movement building. And you're right. I mean, the anti-war movement is not having massive demonstrations like they were during the Iraq War of 100,000 people and hundreds of people getting arrested and things like that. But I think that's also an issue of objective conditions, right? I mean, the state is prone to crisis, whether it's economic crisis or a war crisis like the Iraq War, because it was a military defeat by an unpopular president. And so it gave the conditions for organizing to happen. So it doesn't matter how many leaflets we pass out right now for an anti-war demonstration, you're not going to get, you know, you're going to get 100 or more people at this anti-war demonstration. But that can change because the objective conditions don't exist for tens of thousands of people to come to an anti-war demonstration. But that can change very, very quickly. You know, once the war drums start beating against a war with Korea or a confrontation with Russia or an invasion of Venezuela, any of the thing, or a war initiated with Iran or naval battle with Iran, all of the things that are actually being floated around in very real ways by this administration, I'd be willing to bet that if that began as a serious thing, you would see the level of demonstrations that you saw, like we saw in the lead up to the Iraq War, which, you know, which actually led to the biggest demonstrations in the world, like worldwide coordinated demonstrations ever in human history. I think that would very quickly change the conditions and change the potential for large-scale, massive resistance to the war machine. But what's important, as I go back to what I was saying before, is are you ready for that moment, right? I mean, so if you're someone who's an anti-war person and you're frustrated with the state of the anti-war movement now, but you still feel dedicated to that cause, you know, it's not about getting the big demonstrations right now. It's about doing the day-to-day organizing, grassroots connections, all the things that are important. So when Trump announces, hey, we might go to invade Venezuela, you're already ready to print out the leaflets, organize a demonstration, and you're ready to go. I mean, that's what happened with the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. There were people that spontaneously organized, but there was also anti-war activists who had been having small demonstrations of a dozen people regularly, but then they were prepared when that started. And I think I would be very surprised if under the Trump administration, there's not an opportunity that comes up like that, because I don't think, you know, the big war hawks in Washington are going to let the opportunity pass of a guy who's willing to do the kind of stuff that George W. Bush did.
That's chilling and probably true. I think you mentioned Venezuela. Iran is also really high on the target board right now. Ben, I think this would be a good place to wrap up. You want to add anything?
Yeah, before we end here, I want to talk a little bit about the work you've been doing as a journalist, Mike. So you're a producer of one of my favorite shows, one of Max's favorite shows, that's the Empire Files, which you produce, and the host, Abby Martin, was in fact our guest on our last episode, another good friend of the show. And you also just recently started a podcast. So I want to talk about both of those, but let's start with the Empire Files really quickly here, just because I want you to talk about the situation you're in. You had been producing for a while. I mean, it was incredible how prolific you were. I think you were doing weekly episodes in these incredible documentaries. And then you had to cut back because Telesur, which is funded by numerous Latin American governments, lost funding because the government in Argentina elected a right-wing president, Mauricio Macri. and then in other countries they cut funding as well. And now your show is basically censored. It was taken off the air because of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. So can you talk about the situation you're in with your show and how people can support the work you and Abby are doing?
Sure. I mean, yeah, just to sum it up really quickly, I mean, we had a contract with Telesur, 50% funded by Venezuela, and that's where it's based. And so, our funding, our budget was wired to us from Venezuela, from the main network. And so it was always difficult because of different sanctions on Venezuela. Things would always be delayed. So it would always be kind of difficult for a while. But then after Maduro won the democratic election, then Trump really clamped down his sanctions. And that was a point where we felt that it was impossible to get payments through. And then our network said that they didn't see any way to get any payments through anymore. And so we launched a fundraiser to go independent on GoFundMe and Patreon for Empire Files. And we've actually been really amazed at the level of support we've gotten. And so, we just announced, I think yesterday, a couple days ago, that we're actually going to be able to continue on an independent basis for this foreseeable future. And so we're really excited to be beginning it in a new phase of it on a much smaller budget, but of course on one that will be able to allow us to complete maybe not the weekly documentaries that we had before, but definitely regular enough to where we're producing regular content. So
yeah, and that's such great news because it's such an amazing show. And as someone, I support it as well. We'll also link to the Patreon and GoFundMe accounts in the information for this episode for anyone who's listening who wants to support.
And talk about your podcast briefly. You started a new podcast that I think really is relevant to this conversation we've been having.
Thank you. Yeah, right. Because so many people in the military don't give a shit about John McCain's death, right? And so it's like, but we want to reach those people. As I was mentioning, when the legacy of resistance and rebellion in the Vietnam War, one of the main organizing hubs for that movement was the GI newspaper movement. There were newspapers that were written, printed, and distributed by active duty GIs. And there was over 300 different anti-war GI newspapers circulating during Vietnam. People were reading them on submarines, on aircraft, in the trenches, back in the military bases. It was such a feature, and they did things like they'd have a pig of the month in one newspaper called The Bond, and it was people would vote for what officer they hated the most, and then they'd print his picture on the back page with his head in a noose. So if you're an officer, you did not want to be the pig of the month, especially with all the fraggings going on. But it also advocated for refusing your orders to Vietnam and gave information about how you could do that and why you had the moral and legal right to do that. And so it's in that tradition that I started this podcast with Spencer Rapone, who some of you may know was the infamous commie cadet, the guy who in his West Point uniform revealed a Che Guevara shirt, and then Marco Rubio wanted to have his head on a plate. So, one of the only officers I've ever respected is Spencer Rapone, who was a lieutenant, but after being an enlisted guy for many years. We started a podcast called Eyes Left, and it's in the tradition of that GI newspaper movement. It's a show that is by service members geared towards service members. Of course, if you're not, you can still get a lot out of it, but it's geared towards people in the military because, when both of us have this experience. When I was in the military, I was starting to wake up while I was in the military. Even before going to Iraq, I felt that I was a liberal guy. I was, interested in what protesters had to say against the Iraq war. I was influenceable at the time, but I wasn't influenced. And we know today, I wasn't influenced, it wasn't until after I went to Iraq and became radicalized by that on my own that I became a radical, but it didn't have to be that way. And we know that today, so many different trends show that there's even more potential for that now in the military. The fact that socialism all of a sudden is a popular thing and tens of thousands of people are rushing to join socialist organizations and you could talk about it on a national stage, that's a very new development. The fact that there's this widespread revulsion to Trump and fascism and the far right and all of these things, that's a new development. And so the military is really just a cross-section of US society. And so any social phenomenon that you're witnessing in the general population, that's going to be expressed in some way in the military also. And so knowing that, we want to be able to reach those people, tell them that they're not alone, other people think the way that they think, they're right to be questioning everything, they're right to be questioning their role in it, and bring that to the next level of actually you shouldn't be playing a role in it. And you know what, there's actually a variety of options for you to get the hell out of it and get out with an honorable discharge. And so I spent many years after the military helping counsel soldiers on getting out, whether it's conscientious objector, working some medical discharge, or just going AWOL and deserting and then, getting fighting the legal process once you get back from that. And so we want to bring those experiences and traditions into the show. And so, it involves covering current issues, talking about radical military history, the stories of rebellions that are in the past to show people that if they refuse orders today, they're part of a long tradition of people doing that. So that's the essence of the show. And we're excited that, we've done, I think, 5 episodes so far. And it's, really both of us are really committed to it because we remember ourselves in that position. And if there was some kind of literature or show or something that existed then, we would have been eating it up and probably would have became war resistors a lot quicker than it took us.
Where do we listen to it?
Yeah, so you can find it on Eyes Left on SoundCloud or any major streaming platform, iTunes, Stitcher, all that stuff, it's there. You can find us on social media at Eyes Left Pod to get it there. But yeah, it's easy to find, Eyes Left.
And that is eyes as in like the eyes in your head, eyes left.
Yeah, it's actually a command in the military. Eyes right is a marching command when you look to your commander to salute your commander. So eyes left means not only you're not saluting your commander, you're looking to the left politically also.
That's almost as clever as Moderate Rebels.
It is,
and it will probably be more enduring, hopefully. I don't think there's any Moderate Rebels left in Idlib, which we'll be hearing about soon.
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to announce a new promotion for our show, Moderate Rebels. If you donate $500 or more to our Patreon, you get invited to my birthday, and we'll leak photos of you to the Daily Caller.
I'm in.
You don't even want to know what happens if you donate 1,000.
So, patreon.com/Moderate Rebels.
Yes, thank you so much for listening, and Mike, thank you so much for joining us because you have a very interesting and very important perspective that a lot of Americans and people throughout the world don't really know about. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people discount and even ignore the revolutionary potential of soldiers, veterans, people who have played a very significant role in radical movements in the past and continue to today. So thank you so much for the work you do as a journalist, as an activist, and thank you for joining us today. It was a very good discussion.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Love the show. Take care.